And what you were saying earlier as well, say with the incels, like some of the stuff that the people they blame is wrong, but their belief isn't necessarily completely off. And it was really interesting because, again, the previous podcast talking about stories, the narratives, the scripts that sort of bounce around in your own head that you inhabit. And you can see why figures like Jordan Peterson become so popular, because they offer at least a narrative escape from the situation you might find yourself in. He's saying, look, just clean your room, bucko, and start working hard and everything's going to work out. The order of the world is fine and you just have to deal with it.
He's offering you agency whereas other people are offering you systemic problems but blaming you for your response. I do think liberal leftists really do this a lot. Like they talk about systemic racism, but then conflate it with personal implicit bias and bigotry. And implicit bias and bigotry aren't even the same thing. I find that fascinating as a kind of incoherence of our narrative right now, in which case we're always talking about like privilege. I even find the shift. We used to talk about underprivileged actually versus privileged, which underprivileged, interesting, implies a raise up, whereas privilege implies a pushing down, which I don't think people realize some of the implications in these small changes of language and what they're actually telling us about where we think things are possible. No one really believes that we can raise everybody up, but maybe we can push people down.
That should be a t-shirt. That's so good.
Right. There is definitely that feeling that I get in some people. Yeah.
It's resentment, but it's not just, on one hand, my favorite example of this is also maybe what's driving a lot of this stuff in marginalized communities, right? We have more female and people of color Ivy League university presidents, over half of them, right? And these people are truly elites and they come from wealth and whatever. But the average impoverishment of people of color is static. Hasn't changed at all. Hasn't changed that. It's actually only gotten worse since the Great Recession. And got real bad between 2008 and 2012 because of relative wealth disparity really increasing. And where did it increase? It's pretty easy. If you factor out the top 1% of wealthy people, the difference, there's a 5 times difference in median and wealth. And how we are calculating wealth is assets divided by, subtracted from debts. But it's only actually $200,000. That in America, anywhere in the United States, is worth $200,000. Housing. The wealth gap between races is almost entirely explained by generational trends in housing and by redlining. If you fix housing, it'll go away between most people of color and most non-rich white people, which is something to, it both is a proof of systemic racism in an absolute sense, because these are systemic patterns that are based on compounding changes over time. And it's absolutely a big gap. It's 5 times the amount of relative wealth. There's a bigger gap between poor Black people and not poor middle class Black people and poor middle class white people in the United States in terms of how many times it is. But if you look at the absolute number, it gets pretty sick. All right. So why did all that go away? It's housing policy, right? But you're seeing these people represent you now and making it look like it's possible for you to rise to the heights of power in a way that you couldn't before. So now it's your fucking fault. It's not, you have to deal with all the racism you had to deal with before, but now some people actually can get ahead. But I'm not.
Yes. Yeah. Some really good. I actually think maybe you mentioned in some of your videos, I've nearly finished his book. I finished the first one, The Moral Limits of Markets, or What Money Can't Buy, and then the Meritocracy. I'm going to write to him and see if he wants to come on. I doubt he will, because he's Mr. Harvard and all that sort of stuff. But it is the Meritocracy.
You used to have a show on the BBC.
Really? Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
His sort of book on the meritocratic trap is fascinating. And really, I was saying this the other day in the Discord, that video games are where meritocracy exists. It doesn't exist in real life. Video games are designed for you to win and succeed and rise to the top and all that sort of stuff. But real life is a lot more difficult.
Which unfortunately, I think a lot of the hatred of video games is way overstated and it's had. But I think video games inculcate a lot of good intelligence, actually. But they also teach you that merit matters.
Right.
So one of the things I tell people is if you don't work, you can definitely fail, but you don't succeed because of work. Like, it's a paradox, right? But it's one that I actually try to teach kids as best I can. There's actually a law against saying that meritocracy isn't real in Utah, which is funny for just students, not in general. We have free speech, but not one type of kid. But I have pointed out in classes before that, there's a survivorship bias. Because if you get a break and you know how much work you had to do to get that break, you're going to attribute your success to your work because it was crucial to you to get that break. But you're probably going to miss that most people don't get the break.
Exactly. And society fucking masturbates over the rags to riches story.
Totally. It totally leads people like me. I come from a really working class background, a working poor background for a large part of my life. Not all my childhood. Who got into college, got a graduate degree, etc. My brother who did too, he's a conservative. I'm not, but I was for a little while. Because you go back and you see all these social pathologies, and I go back to the South, I'm like, everyone here is an alcoholic. Even today, I have to fight this in myself. Right? I go, everyone here is an alcoholic. Like, why are they so dumb? And I got over this stuff. Why can't you? I got over addiction. Why can't you? There's pretty goddamn good reasons why they couldn't. I got a lot of breaks. But that's not my first inclination. Like, even as a sociologically aware as I am, my first inclination, the one that I have to battle, is I have to always remind myself of my breaks, of who helped me, because it's very easy when you go back and look at that and go, this is fucking destructive. Why are you doing it? And forget that you also did it when you were in the situation.
Yeah, I would be interested actually what both of you think about the idea of self-flattery, because I think that a lot of political thinking often tends to be like that. Maybe just all thinking. I've become more suspicious of self-flattery, mainly because I'm a sort of British sort of masochist. But I think
it's one of the few things I like about the British is you guys are masochists.
But yeah, it's one of those things. It's like the self-flattery thing, I think, explains why people shut the door after them, right? Like, they'll kick the ladder away. It's, I did it. Just try. You have to suffer as much shit as I did to get to where I am.
It perpetuates a lot of bad social habits and a lot of hazing and that sort of thing. So yeah, but I think it's, so here's my challenge to leftists. It's not just that kind of self-flattery. It's also the self-flattery that you'd have the theory to really understand what's going on. Why do you think you're special if no one else understands what's going on? If your response is, oh, the masses don't see what I see, why don't they all just get together and have solidarity? Motherfucker, right. You're not that special.
Yeah.
Like, you are produced by the same thing that's producing them. So you have to ask yourself, what's the function of this psychologically versus what's the function of it in actual politics? Like, when are we doing politics and when are we flattering ourselves that we see through the system? Maybe a lot more people see the system than you think, A. And B, if that's true, maybe it also doesn't matter that you see through the system. What maybe matters is what we do with that. And a lot of people get stuck in step 1 and 2 because when you try to start articulating what you need to do, the complexity of it is overwhelming. Like, I have all kinds of stuff I say we could do to help these kids out, but actually doing them, it's hyper complex. It really is.
Yeah. What's your thought on universal basic services?
That's a no-brainer starter. Let's just make sure people can survive. Let's make sure there's a glass floor for everybody, not just for certain people. Like, and that being said, services, I'm a little bit more ambivalent about stuff like universal basic income, but I think universal basic services, like, we make sure that people have housing, have some public spaces, et cetera, even in a capitalist society. And when people come after the bar, you're saying this and you're a communist, none of this is communism. I'm like, yeah, but I'm also trying to deal with the immediate problems at hand. We can talk about communism later. The current group of people are so alienated, they wouldn't be able to do what you want them to do anyway. think you're just going to accelerate them into an insurrection against a nuclear armed drone state, you are dumber than anybody I've ever talked to. So sit down and consider what you're actually saying.
That's exactly it. That the idea that you rally the troops when the morale is as low as it is that's another form of role playing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of why we can't get beyond politics as LARPing is because we are all LARPing politics right now. We are using politics as a substitute for other forms of community. It is the primary way we interact with social media, etc. And for a lot of people also, it's a way that they interpret their values towards the world. It's totally political, like their morality is politics. And this is beyond the scope of us talking today about kids, but I think that's a disaster. It's like you will have both bad morality and bad politics by doing that. And you need good morality because you need pro-social inclinations. You need people to trust you. You need to have the resources of community to do what you want to do. And that's not even assuming the kind of pseudo-war footing that a lot of these people want to pretend that they're at. It's like you have to turn it into something positive. You have to. Otherwise, you just have a bunch of hashtag movements that can express the wail of anger. And I'm not here to delegitimize that, but can't do anything after that's happened. Like the world continues to be unchanged.
Yeah. And I think on the personal level, it really is about feeling like if the world is throwing shit at you, that you have the ability to handle it. And that being the root of confidence, I think is, even on a small scale, I imagine that's where you can do something as a teacher or an educator, is presumably maybe you have seen that play out in action, where someone goes from not believing in their abilities to believing in their abilities.
That's really the only thing you can do, but I will say it's getting, a lot of educators feel like it's getting harder and harder to see that. That's why there's so many people in your profession. That used to be, we would put up with all kinds of exploitive shit because we would see that. Teachers and nurses are an interesting demographic of society because they're highly skilled, they're educated, they have privileges, but their pay never raises above inflation. They're increasingly proletarianized, and their work conditions are awful.
Social services as well.
Yes. The social services is a similar thing. I think social services is like so many people have given up on going into that, but you definitely see it. For a lot of people, nursing in particular is your way out of the lower strata of workers, right? But it's not going to get you out of being a worker. But this is why I find so much of this PMC talk so deracinated, is it's not dealing with the differences in these groups. And I'm not going to get into that now, but one of the things about nurses, social workers, teachers is we see the best, teachers in particular, and maybe nurses, we see the best and we see the worst all the time. My job inevitably deals with, if it's not your student, it's someone's student, you're going to have to deal with the family of a dead kid eventually. You're not behind that. It's not, you get it. You usually have very little role, but you're going to have to deal with that. And that's never easy to do. You're going to have to deal with seeing kids who deal with home abuse that you can't really do much about, even if you report it correctly, and if you report it too much, they might be put in a foster system, which may be just as bad. It's luck of the draw. You're going to have to deal with people with substance addictions. You're going to have, but you do have that thing that you're talking about, where we do see successes, we do see people get better, we do see people change, which is why we aren't totally like cops. One of the things I point out to people is, even if you were a good person, if you're a cop, you're exposed to the worst shit every day, and you're doing it to protect property. What do you think it's going to do to you? It's not going to make you a good person. Like, I've actually told people, I don't think anyone should do that job for their whole life. Like, it's just too much, even in a much better society.
It's corrosive.
It's corrosive. And I've actually pointed out, I don't think if you had a socialist society, I don't think that can tidily fixes it, because some of the stuff would still exist. There'd be a lot less of it. But like occasionally, I think even under ideal socialist conditions, and I think they would be dramatically less, but you would still have rape and murder. You still got to deal with that.
Yeah, it's basically radiation poisoning, isn't it? And it's like the more you're exposed to it.
It is more of a drug. I do think like traditional religions are wrong about that. If you see enough of that shit, it's going to do something to you. If nothing else, like you're actively giving yourself complex post-traumatic stress disorder.
A huge part of that is also why you end up seeing a certain level of callousness in like our medical and social service system, because even
in teachers,
yeah, and teachers, especially if you deal with like emergency medicine, you probably see some of the most burned out professionals in that sector. And a lot of times that comes from just constantly seeing like the worst case scenarios that you can't really do a whole lot about all the time.
It's like disempowering at the most fundamental level, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. It also encourages you to think about certain kinds of people in certain ways. It reinforces all your biases. So any bias that you have is going to be amplified.
Yep.
Because you're going to have plenty of evidence there to see it. Like one of the things I've pushed on people who, bring it back to students, who talk about getting rid of tests because they're biased and systemically racist, which they are. Right? That's not my point. You know what else is biased and systemically racist? Grades.
Yeah.
Classroom grades not only sort out by racial and class differences, they even sort out by skin tone, which means that you have magnifying biases over time. I think some of that's bigotry, but I don't think even most of it's bigotry. It's compounding biases. It's compounding bias confirmation. And if you think you're special and not given to it, you're probably going to be more likely to do it. Most teachers, most healthcare professionals think that, I've dealt with this long enough. I know I'm above this, but you're not. All right. That thing about self-flattery. So I like to whenever I talk with the young people are fucked, which is a lot of I talk about like right now. I also say we do have to talk about their virtues because they have some that like people in my cohort didn't. They are superficially more knowledgeable about more things. They're less deeply knowledgeable about a lot of stuff, but they're exposed like as provincial as Americans may seem to Europeans now. It's nothing compared to the 1990s where we barely knew the rest of the world existed. Like, our country is like, what, a third of a continent? And it's a very big continent at that. Like, Texas itself, like a fifth of Europe.
Yeah.
Well, so it's easier for us to be parochial anyway. Then you add to that fact that we're a hegemon, so everyone speaks our language. Then you add to that fact that we have shitty news coverage that didn't used to cover international news. Of course, we didn't know anything about anywhere. And if we did know anything about anywhere, it wasn't even our neighbors. It was you guys in the UK. Because we got your media sometimes. Like we all, like in the 90s, like we all knew who Tony Blair was, but we didn't know who the Prime Minister of Canada was. Or, oh my God, the President of Mexico. No one knew that. And kids today know that. We've already mentioned, they're less bullying. They're more egalitarian in their attitudes towards sex and dating, but they don't have a lot of relationships and they're really lonely. It's real hard to explain. These kids are really much, but even conservative kids, religious conservative kids, you do meet people who double down on asshattery. One of the things I'll say when you meet like under 20 reactionaries, they're really reactionary. It's like a social commitment to being a reactionary. But one of the things that I can say is in general, like people are more egalitarian on sex and gender lines. Even conservatives don't want to generally be perceived as racist. It's not to say that they want to not be racist necessarily, but they really don't want to be conceited unless you're one of these reactionaries who doubles down on that. Like, there's a lot less people carving swastikas in the desk these days.
Here's the other thing, though, is as these people age, provided they're able to navigate a particularly complex part of time of their life, if and when they have children, it'll be interesting to see their attitude to technology, because best case scenario is that you do get some perspective.
I'm hopeful. Okay, no, I'm actually not hopeful about this generation, but I am hopeful about their kids when they have them, and if they have any significant number of them, because they're going through a very hard time socially. We haven't had a generation to go through the kinds of changes that we're seeing now since the 40s, really, and particularly in the United States. Like, it's a little bit different in Europe, but particularly in the United States, it's been a long time since we've had traumas that affect everybody.
And it's a breeding ground that politically can go a couple of different ways, right? I guess dystopia is just fascism because it just it hoovers up all these people and it says, hey, here's the enemy. We have a purpose. And then there's the shining lights of socialism or communism or something like that.
I think we need to temper all that to some degree. I think 21st century socialism, but when it actually starts to matter, it did ever actually start to matter. The prohibition in America against being Marxist has finally gone away. But has that meant as much? No, ironically. The Overton windows meet, but none of the actual politics have. And in fact, in some ways, we're further away from certain things. Like, we were more likely to get Medicare for all in 1992, which is something that I think really that people who are not in their 40s need to realize. There was a more realistic debate about this in the beginning of the 90s than after Biden won 2020. And the problem seems so unfixable because, like, our judicial apparatus is just doing anything almost impossible and reversing things. Like, we're having rights reversed, which is not something that happens a lot in history. But as it can and does happen, and how do you respond to that? That's going to be a lot, and these kids are living through it. At the same time, they also don't really understand how bad it was very recently. I can't tell you like how many people didn't know what a sundown town was until they saw it on Lovecraft Country. Now, I grew up with that shit. Like, in 1992, we still had a segregated prom court, and we were woke because we had an integrated prom model. But they still didn't want to make the prom king accident segregated, so they had a separate one. And it wasn't even like Black versus white activists into that. It was the introduction of more groups and figuring we couldn't have that many prom courts. And that's only 25, 26 years ago. That's something that I think about in the United States. It's just like people who are younger don't really realize how bad it was recently. Plus, they're being told things are worse all the time by the left. And
yeah.
And in some ways, the left, there are things in which the left is right about it being worse. And there are other times where I'm like, it's just more out in the open now. It's not worse. And in some ways, when you say that, you're like flattering the baby boomers and whatnot. Because you're like, oh, we've never been more polarized than we are under Trump. But I'm like, in the late 1970s, there was something like 3,000 political bombings in the United States.
Wow.
Major figures were being assassinated from the mid-60s all the way to the mid-70s.
Reagan was the last one.
Maybe security forces just got better.
Like, yeah, exactly. But it's also things are we're more polarized. And I'm like, in superficial ways, yeah, but we're also not really, we are killing each other. But honestly, this is going to sound counterintuitive. I think given the amount of polarization, the amount of political violence is actually weirdly low. Particularly when you think about how many fucking guns there are in this country. Like, we have, what is it? For every 100 people, we have 120 guns.
Looking back in hindsight, I feel 90s with the Ruby Ridge and Waco and everything was a lot more kind of scarier than it is now.
Yeah, but we didn't live with it constantly beating over our head until 9/11. That's the difference. Like, kids today really, for example, we've done these active shooter drills in the United States. Like, I do them 3 times a year until I move to a hybrid program. So it's like 70% online, 50% in person. But before that, I did those drills twice a year, right? And the kids would have panic, total anxiety. Now, for all that I talked about, like 600 mass shootings a year, school shootings a year, let me phrase that. The vast majority of these kids will still never see a school shooting. They just won't. This is not to mean you shouldn't be taking care of it. This is not to mean it isn't a real threat. But like, we do sell it as if it is, every kid being shot all the time. That's not true. This is a country of 320 million people. It is not true that most people are going to experience a school shooting directly. But we run them through these drills like it's an everyday experience. And we've done it for so long now that even if we do have a school shooting, all the shooters know what we do. That's all gone through the same system.
Yeah.
It's common knowledge here.
So in
Everybody
effect,
knows.
you've just traumatized generations of people for an event that was probably very unlikely to happen. But you've made the threat bigger and scarier than
real.
It is. Yeah, more real.
Whereas, you know what these people should be afraid of, right? That they're going to be alone and feel desperate and have a gun nearby and shoot themselves. That's the number one reason that they're likely to go buy a gun. Number one, more than anything else, is suicide. Number one cause of gun deaths in America is suicide. Number two is like partner murders. Number three is cops. Number four is drug related. Like, it's not random. So,
right, and if you actually point this out, some people get really mad.
Well, shoot you.
One of the things, I guess I'm somewhat controversial on the left because I both am okay with gun control, but I really think we oversell it because Mexico has gun control. You have to have a whole lot of other social services and stuff for it to work. So comparing it to say, France or Australia or Japan or Korea, that's not a very apt comparison to the United States. Like, the countries that are more like us actually are like in Latin America. So gun control could work, but it only work with massive social changes inculcated into it, like relative egalitarian, providing people other means, ending the drug war and incentivizing using the guns this way, better mental health care, all those things would dramatically help. And yeah, it has to be holistic. And so I've been accused personally of look, oh, you're a gun forgiving. No, I'm not against gun regulations. Like, I'm not. I don't carry a gun. I'm licensed to. I've been trained in it. I don't keep one around because I know that the most likely person that I would hurt with that is someone who I really care about, which is either my partner or me. Like, just statistically speaking. And like, to be honest, statistically speaking, the most things going to happen with that gun, nothing. It's just sitting there. But I would just rather not have to worry about that. The trade-off isn't worth it. I still actually keep my shooting skills up. I go and use range, but I don't own a weapon. And I figure if things really came to shit where we're like fighting in the streets and we need weapons right now, I could get one. This is not my point, but I think we've traumatized a generation of kids for a problem that is real and getting more serious. I don't want to downplay the problems of school shootings. They're real, but the suicide epidemic is far worse.
Yeah, and essentially there's an offloading of responsibility onto teachers and young people.
Fucking children and teachers.
When actually the responsibility lies with politicians, like you said, essentially putting in something like UBS, and then you go, okay, to my mind, it's simple. That may be very difficult to achieve, but if you have something like universal basic services, maybe then you can start making assessments about what human beings are like, right? But until people have a foundation, all theories about human behavior are just hot air.
Absolutely. I think that's a fair game. We can talk about why is the murder rate so much higher in the United States than it is in Britain. I'm not sure actually it is always higher in Britain, in the United States and Britain anymore. But there are definitely cities. There are cities that have the murder rate of Ecuador in the United States. The average murder rate is pretty low, but there are places where it's up to like 50 and 100,000. The average, and I think the US is I think it's gotten up to 7 per 100,000. And the average in the UK is like 1.5 or 2 per 100,000. But in London, it can get up to, 6 or 7. But the reason why the murder rate's so much higher is it's just more lethal because our healthcare sucks. If I got shanked in the UK, not that I want the trauma associated with it, but if I have healthcare and it's provided for me by the state, at least I know they're going to take care of me and I'm going to survive a shanking, it's still a better place to be.
I think we should end it on the shanking note. Thanks very much for your time.
Yes, thank you so much, as always.
Thank you. I get to talk about what I actually do for my day job as opposed to educating people about everything else.
Yeah, but it's really fascinating, actually. It's the idea that lots of people are tuning in because they want an education as well, right? They're hungry for it. They're hungry for the things, your perspective, the stuff that you've read, the filter that you provide on, your interpretation of stuff. And it's maybe it's not easier than reading a book, but it's education. There is something about that. The fact that there's lots of people out there who want to learn is great.
Yeah, I think my response would be, this is my last thing I would say. I think the idea that people like being dumb is totally fucking misguided. Like, there is will for ignorance. People will like being ignorant on certain things because it challenges them. It hurts them, causes cognitive dissonance. But in general, I don't know. I've never met anyone who really likes the idea of not knowing things. I don't meet kids who really, they might celebrate that they don't read, but the reason why they celebrate that they don't read is because they don't think it's going to help them. It's not because they want to be dumb. And that shift in attitude, I think we just all need. Is you got to approach people in general with the idea that, like, most people really do want to be better. They just have no idea what better means. And also, you can't decide that for them either. Like they have to decide it for themselves.
Right. And on that note, I'll just make this one comment, and I swear it's not a derail. One aspect of kind of like the pessimism that I see in a lot of the younger adults that I talk to today is that there is a lot of acceptance, but there is a lot of acceptance that are based on that these are biological things, these are genetic things, and that there's a lot of pessimism about the ability to change.
Yeah.
Everything is systemic, and like a lot of the pessimism is like this overwhelming feeling that people express of there is no ability to change within the system that we have, and that kind of transports to a lot of negative areas.
Yeah, I agree with that. I always tell people that because things are systemically bad, you actually have to demand more of yourself, not less. But that's a very unpalatable position.
I think that's actually a fucking great point. And again, it explains why people like Jordan Peterson are so popular, because they empower people, even if it's empowering them with a whole bunch of junk bullshit that goes, but it's empowered bullshit. And that's something that is maybe perhaps missing in the left thing of the analysis. Everything's systemic. And I think your response to that is bang on.
Yeah, everything is systemic, but you still got to be better.
And ultimately, that pessimism ends up hitting a brick wall a lot of times in terms of when we really want substantial things like criminal justice reform.
Yeah, because a lot of people don't believe it's really possible. Yeah, in general, like, a lot of people misread me as a doomer because I'm often telling them what they're going to do is not going to work. But the underlying message is actually like, if you accepted reality as it was, you could start to change things. It would be slow. Even if it was revolutionary, it'd be slow at first. And you don't really know when all the changes pay off or when they tip or any of that. You don't know. No one can. And if anyone tells you that they do, they're probably conning you. But it is possible. We know it's possible because it has happened. Change has happened. And the idea that we either are going to be in a moment where we could act and make Bernie our God King and change the world, or like we're in a techno-utopian neoliberal hellscape for the rest of the time, I don't think that binary serves people. I really don't. And particularly not young people, because this is where they could do stuff. And if we tell them there's no hope for anything, then the worst traits of now will go on forever. Even to me, sometimes it does feel that way. I have to remind myself that I personally, for my own life, know that is not always true.
I feel like I could continue this conversation for a long time, but I really think there is something about, and Eco's raised this before, this idea of the kind of empowerment, self-help thing, although that term is obviously loaded, shouldn't be left to the right wing.
I wish we had a way to talk about self-help and community help at the same time. Because even interestingly, right wingers in churches actually do understand this. Because you make yourself better for your community because they know that your community is going to be why you make yourself better. People really, one of the interesting things is it's actually harder to motivate yourself to be better for just yourself. It's actually ridiculously hard to do.
A lot of these, self-help motivations, it makes you more attractive to people. It makes you you are more of an admirable figure, an aspirational figure for your community, right? Not just for yourself.
But the one thing I would say is so much of this is tied on like class status and class anxiety. Like we complain about incels and we go, oh, they could make themselves better. It would be really easy. I made myself better. I'm like, yeah, sure. I made myself better too with a lot of bikes. And I don't have a lot of sympathy for incels. But I have a lot of sympathy for the pre-incel because there's a whole lot of people who try to make themselves better and get nothing for it, and you don't reward them, and we don't know how to talk about them. One of the things that I'd floated to talk to Aoki about on a different occasion was like, I think there's a crisis of masculinity in general, but particularly on the left, because a framing for what it means to move beyond post like toxic masculinity isn't there. And when people try to bring it up, they get screwed at. It's not a great thing, but so much of what we tell people, like, oh, guys need to go to therapy. That's a common thing about people dating people. I'm like, yeah, but that, whether you realize it or not, that's a class marker. Like most people in America can't afford that. Like, you know how I knew that I was now thoroughly, truly in the upper echelons of the middle class? I could afford therapy because I had good enough insurance. Yeah. So there's so much you have to untie with that. I would be a lot more sympathetic to those kinds of complaints about people if we had universal basic services, because there's more of a reason why this person sucks and there's those conditions.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's my last thought.
Okay. Yes, we should end. Yeah. Thank you once again.
Thank you
for your time.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much.